Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the book From Paul to Valentinus by Peter Lampe. This is our penultimate lesson. It's pages 385 to 405. We only have one lesson to go after this, and we get into Gnostic teaching here. So let's go to block 1, the Gnostic teachings of Valentinus. Churches begin seeking independence. Even though there did exist a unity of bishops from all the different fellowships, and fellowship did exist between churches for the most part, but Victor of Blastos was the first congregation to seek independence as a protest against false teachers. So false teaching was beginning to rise up and cause some disunity. And the opposition was to Thalantes Panta Gnosis, those who are seeking all gnosis. These false teachers were Gnostics. Their goal was they professed to seek all gnosis, full gnosis. They held the following convictions. They believed the church was a spiritual organism made up of psychics and pneumatics. A believer begins as a psychic, but some are gifted and can reach the level of pneumatics. And that is the level of the higher level of Gnostic understanding. So in the Gnostic false teaching, they had a higher echelon of believers who could be gifted and reach the level of a pneumatic Gnostic understanding. Early Gnosticism, they believed that one must get past the naive interpretation of the Old Testament. Remember, Paul taught the Old Testament in typology, but the Gnostics, they taught the Old Testament as allegory. So Paul taught typology, but the Gnostics, Valentinus, taught allegory. And they said that most Christians have a very naive interpretation of the Old Testament, and they must take up a different interpretive method of employing allegory. And they claimed that any augmentation of the faith on their part was based on the words from the Redeemer. And even the early Justin, in his early part of his apology, did not list the Valentinians as heretics. Later he did, but in his early apology he did not. Later he did. But in block 2, the name given to the Gnostics was Lathrodidaskalon, those who teach in secret. Lathrodidaskalon, those who teach in secret. Valentinians, for the most part, joined in with the Christian fellowship, but it caused confusion to outsiders because they were presented with two different ways of teaching. These Valentinians were employing allegory, and so this confused outsiders when they viewed Christianity. These Gnostics were not true Christians. Now, Irenaeus, in 180 AD, he declared that Christians should not have fellowship with the Gnostics because, he said, we do not agree in doctrine and we do not agree in ethics. This is very similar to the Apostle John's opinion in 1 John. Irenaeus in 180 said they don't represent true Christian doctrine or true Christian ethics. Now, Marcion appeared in Rome from Asia Minor around 140 AD. And remember, 1 John, where did it come from? Asia Minor. So Marcion, who was opposed by the Apostle John, entered Rome in 140 AD to be opposed there, and he posited the belief that the Old Testament God and the New Testament God were two different gods. Finally, in 144 AD, Marcion was declared a heretic by the church. But these Gnostics were called Lathrodidaskalon, those who teach in secret, those who teach Gnosticism in secret. Now, Cerdo in the 130s, or Cerdo in the 130s, was one of these two-faced Christians who taught in secret. He had a large group of followers. One of his followers was Marcion. So think of it this way. How did Gnosticism creep into Roman Christian thought? Well, it migrated from Asia Minor and then appeared in Rome. And around 140 AD, and then later, it only took about 4 years of this false teaching to get distributed, and then in 144, it was declared heresy. So, Gnosticism, we know Valentinus came from Alexandria, but it looks like Marcion came from Asia Minor. So Gnosticism immigrated into Rome through Alexandria and through Asia Minor, both, and was declared heresy in 144 AD. They taught in secret. They acted like they were genuine members of the church, but secretly they had other teaching meetings at another time. So they had a double purpose. They weren't really true members of the fellowship in the church. Now, Block 3, the evolving monarchy of bishops. Archbishop Victor of 189 AD was the first to attempt to become an overall leader of the bishops in Rome, but instead, all the churches considered themselves to be cells of one overall church, but a formal monarchy of bishops only evolved in the second half, in the late 2nd century. Ecclesiastical interrelatedness. Outside communication to other Christian fellowships did take place from Rome as a whole through a representative, and one such representative was Clement of Rome. But even Clement of Rome, as prestigious a person as he was not considered the head of a monarchy of bishops. But he did at times represent the Roman Church as a whole, Clement of Rome. Now, tracing apostolic succession, in the 2nd century, a 12-member list was made up of bishops who did represent the apostolic tradition. And what was emphasized was a succession of doctrine. In other words, these 12 were faithful to apostolic doctrine. This occurred in 180 AD. And finally, in 180 AD, the monarchical episcopacy did evolve. The monarchy of bishops did evolve in 180 AD, very late 2nd century. But initially, it was a 12-bishop list. They initially had a 12-bishop list. And they did obviously they considered themselves to be interrelated fellowships, and they did reach out to other Christian communities from Rome as a whole, represented by Clement of Rome at times, but a monarchy of bishops really didn't evolve until around 180. But the critical thing to understand in this lesson, the foundational teaching in this lesson, is all about getting back to the title of the book. How did the church in Rome evolve from the theology of the cross in Paul, which was distributed throughout the various house church fellowships in Rome? How did that evolve into these philosophical schools that attracted outside teachers from Asia Minor and from Alexandria? Valentinus from Alexandria, Marcion from Asia Minor, who taught Gnosticism and taught heretical ideas like the Old Testament God differs from the New Testament God, and Jesus was not truly incarnate. These Gnostic heresies crept into the Roman fellowship, specifically into the philosophical schools, the Christian philosophical schools, and they were considered Lathro-didaskalon, those who teach in secret. They pretended to be true members of the Christian faith, true members of the Christian fellowship, but then they would leave that fellowship and have other meetings and teach Gnosticism and teach that the Old Testament was to be interpreted as allegory, almost exclusively as allegory, not typology. There's a big difference in transition right there. Paul taught a typology present in the Old Testament. The Gnostics taught the Old Testament interpreted through allegory. Now, allegory is significantly different than typology. Typology is a much more conservative position. Allegory becomes overly speculative, overly theoretical, and was the methodology, the hermeneutic of the Gnostics for the Old Testament. They employed allegory, whereas Paul employed typology. But it gives us what we need here. This is our penultimate lesson. It takes us up through page 405, and our final lesson is very short. It's just going to be the summary. 409 to 412. It's just going to be the summary. That's all it's left to discuss, is the summary conclusion by Peter Lampe. So this is the last. It's the penultimate lesson, but it's the final deep content lesson. It's the final lesson with deep content. The final lesson is simply going to be our summary, but here we really get into specific teachings of Gnosticism, how it crept into Rome through Asia Minor and Alexandria, Egypt, and how it crept into Rome through Valentinus and through Marcion, and taught heretical teachings by those who teach in secret. That'll wrap up our penultimate lesson, 385 to 405. We'll pick up next time in our final lesson.